welcome. Step back in time into a world of stone, sweat, and silence. A world where castles didn't simply rise from the earth, they were carved out of human lives. We admire their beauty today, the towering walls, the iron gates, the majestic ramparts. But few ever asked the most important question: how were they built, and what did it truly cost? Because behind every fortress lies a hidden story, a story of men who toiled in deadly cold, blistering heat, and relentless danger. A story of hands that bled, backs that broke, and voices history chose to ignore. We know the names of kings who owned the castles, but not the names of the laborers who built them. So let us peel back the stone. Let us reveal the truth most textbooks never tell. How medieval workers actually built castles, and why the reality is far worse than you think. Castles have always captured the human imagination. We picture towering stone walls against the sky, banners fluttering in the wind, knights standing guard, and kings seated proudly on thrones. We imagine royalty, feasts, shining armor, and epic battles. Even today, tourists walk through castle halls, run their fingers over cold stone, and whisper, "How beautiful, how majestic." But beauty has a price. Those walls may look smooth, strong, and timeless, but behind every stone is a story rarely told. Castles did not rise like magic. They were not built with glory or celebration. They were built with sweat, with hunger, with broken bones, torn muscles, and lives cut short long before their time. Every time you admire a great fortress, what you truly see is the result of thousands of ordinary people suffering in silence. If you lived in medieval Europe and heard that a new castle was being built, you wouldn't cheer. You wouldn't marvel at its architecture or dream of its grandeur. You would think only of work, backbreaking, soul-crushing labor. You would think of endless days, dangerous tools, brutal overseers, and the constant fear that one misstep could end your life. When we speak of castles today, we speak of kings and queens, of knights and lords, of noble families sheltered within stone walls. But we never speak of the people who made those walls real, the ones who wore rags instead of silk, who carried tools on their shoulders until their bodies gave out, whose names were never written in books or carved on monuments. The people history forgot. Most castles took decades to finish. Some took lifetimes. Generations were born, worked, and died, while the same walls rose stone by stone. And every stone meant another day of labor for someone who never had a choice. Workers did not build castles because they wanted to. They built them because they had to be, because the Lord demanded it, because taxes were owed, because hunger drove them to it, because refusal meant punishment or starvation. So when we see a castle today perched proudly on a hill or overlooking a valley, we see strength. We see power. We see something built to last forever. But the truth is darker. A castle is not just a fortress, is a graveyard, not with tombstones and coffins, but with invisible memories of countless souls who paid with their lives. And here's the cruelest part: history gave them nothing in return. No reward, no honor, no stories, no statues. Their sacrifice became invisible, buried beneath the very stones they lifted. Imagine the beginning of a castle's construction. A king or lord announces a new fortress will rise. Trumpets may sound, priests may pray, nobles may toast, but then the orders are given. Workers are summoned, peasants are conscripted, villages lose their men, and the project begins not with ceremony but with suffering. First comes the clearing of land. Forests are felled with axes, hills are flattened, rivers are diverted. Men push massive trees with ropes, chop through roots, and drag trunks away. No machines, no iron vehicles, just raw human strength. Blisters split open their palms. Splinters bury themselves under their nails. Exhaustion sets in before the first foundation is even laid. Then stone must be quarried, not pebbles, but colossal blocks heavy enough to crush a man in an instant. Workers swing hammers as large as their heads. Iron wedges are driven into cracks. Dust fills the air, choking their lungs. When a block finally breaks free, it must be moved in. That's where the real agony begins. Ropes are tied around the stone. Men push, they pull, they strain. The sound of cracking joints echoes through the quarry. If someone slips, the stone does not stop. It rolls, it crushes, it kills, and the work does not pause. There is no moment of silence, no funeral, no mourning. The body is dragged away, and new hands take up the rope. These stones travel for miles. Villagers watch lines of men dragging them through fields, through mud, through snow, through summer heat so fierce it burns the skin. Horses help where they can, but horses are expensive. Humans are not. If a horse is injured, it is rested. If a worker is injured, he is beaten, replaced, or left to die at the construction site. Scaffolding rises thin wooden platforms stacked high against walls that grow taller each year. Workers climb with stones strapped to their backs or cradled in their arms. One loose board, one slippery rope, one dizzy spell, and a man falls to his death. No nets, no harnesses, just a scream, a crash, and silence. Hundreds risk this every day, not out of choice, but necessity. We look at castles and call them strong, yet the people who built them were anything but strong by the time their work was done. Their strength was stolen by hunger, exhaustion, and a life where rest was a luxury they could never afford. Some earned a penny a day, just enough for stale bread and thin soup. Many worked not for coin, but to avoid punishment, and the cruel irony, the very walls they raised were not for their protection. Castles were built to control them, to intimidate them, to remind them that the king held power and they were nothing. If an enemy came, workers would not hide behind those walls. They would be left outside to die while the nobles stayed safe behind the stones. Peasants' hands had lifted. Imagine building a fortress with your bloodline to perish beyond its gates. This is the part of history most books skip, because it's easier to admire stone than to remember the bones buried beneath it. Every time we see a castle in a photograph, in a film, standing on a windswept hill, we gaze upon the silent result of human suffering. Walls that took decades of labor, towers that swallowed generations, gates that closed on the very hands that forged them. Kings took the credit, nobles celebrated the design. Builders were forgotten. Think of the popular tales, heroic knights, brave monarchs, glorious sieges. But the real story isn't in the throne room. It's in the dirt, in the mud, in the blood spilled on swaying scaffolds, in the hands of men who worked until their fingers cracked open and bled. Tourists today admire carvings and grand halls. They photograph towers and gatehouses, But the workers who shaped those stones never stepped inside. They never attended feasts. They built a world they would never live in. And that is the heartbreaking truth. Castles are symbols of power because they were built on the backs of those who had none. So when you look at a castle, whether in person, in a book, or in your mind, try to see beyond the stone. Try to see the silent army of forgotten laborers who lifted those walls. Imagine the hands that carried the rock, the backs bent under impossible weight, the legs trembling on unstable wood, the stomachs empty, the families waiting for fathers who never returned. Their names are lost, their stories erased, but their work still stands. That is why the story of how castles were built is not a tale of glory. It is a tale of sacrifice, a tale history tried to hide behind beauty, a tale carved into every stone, waiting for someone to tell it. Because castles may be majestic, but the truth behind them is far worse than anyone imagines. Kings ordered castles, built but never lifted a stone. Knights guarded the walls, but never raised them. The true builders were the forgotten, the poor, the desperate, the voiceless. When a king announced a new fortress, it wasn't celebration for common folk, it was a sentence, because someone had to build it, and that someone was always those with no power to refuse. In the medieval world, most people were peasants bound to the land, paying taxes in crops, labor, or coin they rarely possessed. When a castle was needed, their lives changed overnight. Women, children, the elderly, prisoners, and able-bodied men were all drawn into the labor force. Some were hired, some volunteered out of starvation. Many were forced. None had a real choice. They rose before dawn before roosters crowed on meager meals of stale bread, onions, or watery porridge if fortune smiled. Then they walked to the site. In summer, the sun scorched their skin and dried their throats. In winter, icy winds sliced through threadbare clothes until fingers turned numb. But weather mattered little. Work continued regardless. If stones didn't move, someone was punished. These were not heroes in armor. They wore torn wool, rough trousers, boots that offered little more than scraps of leather. Their clothes were full of holes, shoulders worn raw from ropes, backs slick with sweat and dust. Most owned nothing but the rags on their bodies. They arrived hungry and left broken bones fractured, skin split, hoping only to survive another day. Among them were masons, skilled men who shaped raw stone with hammer and chisel. They turned jagged rock into perfect blocks. Their craft required precision, but it offered no safety. A single slip could send stone flying into a skull. A miscalculation could bring down a wall. And mistakes were met not with patience, but with beatings, fines, or banishment, because kings tolerated no delay. Carpenters built the scaffolding, cranes, gates, and frames that held everything together. They worked high above the ground with saws, mallets, and ropes. One rotten beam, one loose plank, and they fell to their deaths. Many did. No names were recorded, no graves marked. Their bodies were removed, and work pressed on. Blacksmiths, though essential, remained invisible. They forged hammers, chisels, nails, chains, and wheelbands. Their forges burned day and night. Sparks seared their skin, smoke filled their lungs. Molten metal splashed like fire. Their muscles ached from endless hammering. Their ears rang from the clang of iron, and their reward barely enough to keep their families from starving. Then came the laborers, the lowest of the low. Peasants who lost their land, beggars seeking food, villagers seized by force. Some were criminals working for freedom. Others were soldiers fallen from grace. Their task was simple: carry, drag, lift, shovel, push. No skill required, only strength. Strength that eroded slowly, day after day. They hauled stones with ropes that cut into their palms until they bled. They pushed carts heavier than their own bodies. They dug foundations with crude shovels, carved trenches with bare hands, and carried buckets of mortar up swaying scaffolds. Their backs bent under unbearable loads, their knees shook, their feet sank into endless mud. If they tired, they were beaten; if injured, replaced; if they died, no one paused. Prisoners worked, too, chained together, like beasts, pulling stones under the watch of guards, with whips and swords. For them, castle building was slow execution. But perhaps the saddest were the villagers who came only because they had nothing else. A failed harvest, a flood, a tax, or illness could destroy a family. When famine struck, building a castle was sometimes the only path to survival. Peasants walked miles with starving children, desperate for work. They slept on the ground, worked until collapse, and prayed they'd earn enough to feed their kin. Women labored alongside men, hauling water, mixing mortar, carrying stones, preparing food for hundreds. Children ran errands, fetched tools, turned crane wheels, and carried lime. Childhood did not exist for the poor. You worked or you starved. There were no holidays, no weekends, no breaks. Work began at sunrise and ended only when darkness made it impossible to see. Even then, some stayed to mend tools or prepare for the next day. They ate a scrap of food and collapsed where they stood, often in mud, in huts of sticks, or under rags. Rats crawled over them at night. Wolves howled in the distance. Disease followed them everywhere: fever, coughs, infections. Death was always near. Yet they worked not out of loyalty, not out of love for the king, but because the medieval world offered no alternatives. A peasant had two choices: obey or suffer worse. Some were paid in coins, but wages were so meager that a week's labor might equal what a noble spent on a single meal. Others received food: bread, beer, thin soup, maybe meat once in a while, but even that was scarce. Most stayed hungry. Some collapsed from starvation on scaffolds and fell to their deaths. Hunger was as lethal as any accident. It's easy to assume skilled workers fared better, but the difference was slight. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths were valued for their craft, yet treated as tools. Their bodies were pushed to ruin, their injuries ignored, their lives unprotected. And here's something rarely acknowledged: the workers often built castles for the very rulers who taxed them, punished them, and seized their food. A castle was not a gift, it was a symbol of control, a warning, a display of dominance. If peasants rebelled, those walls would shield the lord, not the people. If invaders came, nobles would retreat inside, while villagers were abandoned to die. Imagine the cruelty: building something you'd never enter, shaping stones that would form walls you'd never touch, lifting beams for chambers you'd never sleep in, knowing the fortress you spent your life constructing would protect everyone except you. Many understood this, but they had no voice to resist. The lord owned the land, the homes, the labor. Freedom was an illusion. Overseers watched like wolves over sheep, armed with sticks, ropes, and whips. Their job wasn't to build, but to force others to build faster. If work slowed, punishment followed. If a man weakened, he was beaten until he moved again. If he died, another took his place. There was always another hungry soul to fill the gap. Some overseers measured output by counting stones moved per day. Fall short, and the penalty was swift. Anything that hindered progress, an extra drink of water, a moment's rest, an illness, was met with cruelty. Mercy did not exist on the construction site. Yet, despite the horror, thousands came because life beyond the walls was just as brutal. Poverty, disease, and death were everywhere. Castle work was hell, but starvation was worse. A man who couldn't feed his family was deemed useless. His children would die young. So even if the labor was brutal, even if pay was pitiful, even if danger loomed constantly, people came anyway. Rarely. In quiet moments, a worker might feel pride watching a wall climb higher, a tower pierce the clouds, a gate finally stand firm. But pride didn't heal broken bones or fill empty bellies. Pride didn't shield them from oblivion, and forgotten they were. History remembers the kings who commissioned castles. It recalls the architects who designed them. It honors the nobles who dwelled within. But the men and women who carried the stones, cut the wood, forged the iron, and mixed the mortar vanished from the record. No one wrote their names. No one honored their sacrifice. No one preserved their lives. They were born in poverty, worked in misery, and died in silence. Their legacy wasn't ink, it was mortar and stone. Every castle that stands today is a monument, not to kings, but to suffering. Behind every block is a human story of someone who bent beneath its weight. Behind every tower is a man who risked his life to finish it. Behind every gate is a worker who never passed through it. The world admires castles as symbols of strength, but the real strength belonged to those who built them. Their hands shaped history. Their sweat mixed with mortar. Their blood stained the earth. Their lives were the price of stone. And yet the world forgot them. But look closely. Stare at the rough surfaces, the uneven joints, the tool marks, still visible after centuries. You can still see the hands that lifted them. You can feel the weight they bore. You can hear the echoes of hammers, the shouts of overseers, the groans of men straining under impossible loads. Their bodies are gone, but their work remains. Castles were not miracles. They were not wonders of engineering alone. They were the product of endless human suffering, done by people who would never see glory, never gain reward, and never escape the life they were born into. That is the truth of who built medieval castles. Not kings, not knights, but ordinary people whose names history erased. Work on a medieval site was not merely difficult, it was relentless, exhausting, and terrifying. Every day was a battle between the human body and impossible demands. Workers didn't just labor, they lived in a world where every hammer swing, every stone lift, every rope pull brought them closer to collapse or death. At dawn, work began. Before the sun fully rose, men were already at the quarry, hammering stone from the earth. The clang of iron on limestone echoed for miles. The ground trembled with each blow. Dust clouds rose until every breath felt like swallowing sand. tools were heavy. Men were exhausted before the day truly started. But overseers demanded speed. The king would not wait. Breaking stone was only the first step. Once freed, blocks had to be shaped perfectly. Masons used chisels and wedges to split rock into precise slabs. Each block had to fit flawlessly. One crooked stone could weaken an entire wall. One slip could undo days of work. One error could topple a tower years in the making. The pressure was immense. The margin for error nearly zero. Then came transport. No engines, no cranes, just human muscle and crude wooden devices. Dozens of men wrapped ropes around massive stones, ropes soaked in sweat and mud, pulled together. Legs shook, backs bent, veins bulged. Stones scraped across earth, carving trenches with every inch. Every foot forward was paid for in pain. Roads were rough. Mud swallowed boots. Rocks tore skin. The weight pulled men forward until shoulders nearly dislocated. They slipped, fell, were dragged, cried out, and still had to rise and continue. If a stone rolled wrong, it crushed instantly. If a rope snapped, it lashed back with flesh-slicing force. And if progress lagged, overseers shouted, threatened, or struck. There were no protections for injuries. A twisted ankle, a broken finger, a crushed hand, none of it mattered. If you could walk, you worked. If you couldn't, you often starved. Usefulness meant survival. Once dragged to the site, stones had to be lifted. Castles, sword walls, taller than trees, towers piercing the sky. Scaffolding was erected, but it was dangerously unstable. Planks lashed with rope, nails scarce. Platforms wobbled with every step. Climbing while carrying heavy stone was like walking a shaking bridge over death. Imagine a worker 50 feet up on a plank, barely a hand's width wide, holding a stone heavier than himself. Wind pushes him. The plank trembles. Sweat blinds him. His arms quake. One misstep, he falls. No net, no harness, just impact and death. Men fell often. Sometimes entire scaffolds collapsed. Ropes snapped. Pulleys failed. Stones dropped from above, crushing those below. No doctors, no hospitals. The injured were carried off to die on straw. Families mourned quietly. Work continued. The castle mattered more than lives. Lime, used in mortar, burned skin. Workers mixed it with bare hands in wooden troughs. Wind blew powder into eyes, causing blindness, into lungs, triggering coughs that lasted days. Mortar burned through clothes and flesh. Many bore permanent scars. Some lost sight entirely and begged for the rest of their lives. Water posed another danger. Moats and foundations required deep trenches, often below water level. Pits filled with stagnant, filthy water. Mud sucked men down like quicksand. If a wall collapsed into the trench, workers were buried alive. Many drowned in mud, suffocated under soil, or crushed by earth. Some bodies were never recovered. The castle simply rose above their graves, and when not wrestling stone or mud, workers handled timber. Massive logs, cut from distant forests, were dragged by hand. They built craned, simple rope and pulley systems to lift stone, but these cranes were unreliable. Ropes snapped, beams broke, falling stone became a weapon. Accidents weren't rare, they were constant. Fingers lost under wheels, feet crushed under blocks, men impaled by broken tools, hands smashed by hammers, bones shattered from falls, bodies sliced by sharp edges. And without painkillers, every injury was agony, the best remedy. A cloth soaked in wine if anyone cared to offer it. But worst of all was exhaustion. Castle work wasn't a job, it was punishment. From sunrise to sundown, men lifted, pulled, dragged, hammered, dug, muscles burned, joints cracked, backs bent, until standing straight was impossible. A laborer aged 3 times faster than a noble. By 30, he looked 50, by 40, ancient. Many never reached that age. Sweat mixed with dust until skin felt like sandpaper. Clothes clung, soaked in mud, blood, and mortar. Skin blistered. Feet swelled. Hands became calluses and scars. Rain brought mud that swallowed ankles. Snow numbed fingers until tools slipped away. Summer heat turned stones into burning irons. No gloves, no helmets, no padded shoes. Their bodies were their only armor. The sounds never ceased. Hammers on stone, saws on wood, carts rattling, men shouting, overseers barking, and, sometimes, screams, sharp, sudden, cut short. When someone fell, when stone hit flesh, when rope snapped, no one stopped, no one prayed. The body was dragged off, the gap filled before nightfall. Even the strongest broke. Often the strongest died fastest because they were pushed hardest. Show strength, and you're given more. Lift 1 stone easily. Now lift 2. Strength wasn't rewarded, it was exploited. And always there was fear. Fear of falling, fear of being crushed, fear of punishment, fear of losing a limb, fear of hunger, fear of death. Workers lived in fear every hour, knowing one mistake could end everything. Yet castles kept rising stone by stone, layer by layer, year after year, because one man's suffering meant nothing to the king. 10 deaths, nothing. 100, still nothing. The castle had to stand. Human lives were just part of the cost. Some sang while they worked, not from joy, but to drown out pain. Some prayed. Some cursed the lords who enslaved them. Some worked in silence, knowing escape was impossible. Flee, and you'd be hunted. Resist, and beaten. Rebel, and executed. Men died building castles. Some were buried under the walls they raised. Some drowned in moats they dug. Some fell from towers they never saw finished. If ghosts exist, theirs are trapped in the stone forever. Generations worked on a single castle. A father might spend his life on the lower walls. His son would return years later to build the towers. The castle outlived them both. That was the cruel truth. They built something they'd never enjoy for a king who saw them as disposable. And still, the world remembers only the beauty of the walls, the strength of the towers, the brilliance of the design. We marvel at craftsmanship but forget the suffering it demanded. Most never think of the men who hauled stones until their spines cracked. Never think of those who fell to their deaths, whose bones lie beneath the earth. Never think of the pain in every inch of wall. Castles didn't rise from genius alone. They rose because thousands sacrificed their bodies and lives. The work was slow, dangerous, horrifying, but it created something meant to last forever. And it did. Centuries have passed. The workers are gone, their names forgotten. But the stones they lifted still stand. The towers they built still scrape the sky. The walls they bled for still draw admirers who see only beauty, not cost. Every castle is a monument to suffering, not of kings or knights, but of ordinary men, poor, voiceless, nameless, who gave everything and received nothing. Their pain is carved into the stone, their sweat hardened in the mortar, their blood seeped into the foundations, and though history erased their names, the walls remain silent witnesses to the brutality that built them. As the walls climbed higher, the world around the workers shrank. Labor that once touched the ground now reached into the sky. The risk of falling became a daily companion, a shadow that never left. Every step on the scaffolding was a gamble with death. Wooden planks creaked, ropes strained. Workers moved slowly, carefully, but even the most seasoned builder couldn't control the wind, the wood, or simple bad luck. At ground level, a mistake might break a bone. At 50 feet, it erased a life. There were no safety laws, because in the medieval world, laborers weren't valuable enough to protect. If a man fell and shattered on the stones below, the Lord didn't halt construction. No record was kept. No family compensated. Another man was ordered to climb and continue. The scaffolding itself was crude, improvised, shifting, tied with rope or wedged into stone holes. Every day, workers trusted their lives to this wooden skeleton. Imagine a stonemason on a swaying platform, wind pushing against him. Hammer in one hand, chisel in the other, carving stone heavier than himself. Dust stings his eyes, hands ache. He can't wipe sweat, fear of losing balance. One wrong move, one distraction, and he falls. Below, others hear only a scream then. The sound of impact, like meat hitting stone, and the work goes on. The higher the walls grew, the deadlier the work became. Early stages might cause injury, but once walls matched church steeples, a fall meant instant death. Workers who built castles were not protected because they were not seen as worth protecting. Their lives were expendable, their deaths inconsequential, and so the stones rose not through magic, not through glory, but through blood, sweat, and silence. Their names are gone, but their walls endure. And in every crevice, every chisel mark, every uneven joint, you can still hear their story. Those who survived the initial impact of a fall or crushing accident often faced a slower, more agonizing end. Infections festered in wounds that went untreated, broken bones set crookedly or never healed at all, because medieval medicine offered little beyond prayer and poultices. Death might come days or weeks later, quiet, unmarked, and utterly ordinary in a world where human life held little value. Castle construction was as deadly as open warfare. Yet society treated it not as battle, but as routine labors, expected, accepted, even ignored. Even the ropes workers trusted with their lives were treacherous. Made from hemp or animal fibers, they weakened under rain, froze in winter, frayed in summer heat. They snapped without warning. Men tied massive stones to these ropes, believing they would hold, but ropes obeyed no one, not hope, not prayer, not desperation. When a rope gave way, the stone it carried plummeted. Sometimes it shattered on the ground, sometimes it landed on a man. Whispers traveled among crew, stories of laborers crushed so completely their bodies were unrecognizable, flattened beneath the very blocks they'd spent weeks hauling into place. Other tales spoke of workers knocked from scaffolds by swinging stones, tumbling like rag dolls from impossible heights, arms flailing, faces locked in terror. Those below could only step back, clear space, and wait for the inevitable crash. Then they returned to work. Construction never paused for grief or fear. The nobility demanded progress. Lords wanted their castles finished within their lifetimes. Kings needed fortresses to project strength, intimidate rivals, and prepare for war. Delays invited suspicion, and suspicion brought punishment. So foremen drove workers harder, shouting at those who hesitated, striking men who moved too slowly, forcing them to climb ever higher and lift ever heavier loads. This brutality wasn't accidentally, it was systemic. Workers knew that complaining about danger could earn a beating. Refusing to scale a scaffold meant being replaced, and replacement meant starvation. In a world where wages barely covered bread and jobs were scarce, laborers had no leverage. They worked because their families needed food. They worked because winter loomed. They worked because hunger was a sharper torment than fear. Even the weather conspired against them. Rain slicked scaffolding into death traps, wind whipped stones into unpredictable arcs. Frost made wooden planks brittle and treacherous. Summer heat scorched their backs and sapped their strength. There were no weather delays, no days off for snow or storm. If the Lord decreed work must continue, it continued, because nature was no excuse in a system that valued stone over skin. As the castle rose, so did the peril, but the greatest threats weren't always above. Beneath the surface, deep foundation trenches yawned like open graves. Workers descended into pits ringed by walls of unstable earth. One misplaced shovel strike could trigger a landslide. Men vanished in seconds, swallowed whole, their cries muffled by tons of soil. Others dug frantically to reach them, but by the time bodies were uncovered, it was too late. Breathing under such weight was impossible. Then there were tunnels and latrines, narrow, airless passages where workers crawled like animals underground. Torches lit the darkness, but consumed precious oxygen. Many collapsed from lack of air. Some passed out and never woke. Others caught fire when their ragged clothes brushed flame. Underground labor was suffocating, filthy, and fatal. But above all dangers, one haunted every worker: the collapse of unfinished walls. A wall under construction was inherently unstable. Mortar hadn't hardened. Stones hadn't settled. If the base bore even a slight flaw, the entire structure could crumble like a house of cards. Witnesses described sudden cracks splitting the air like thunder. Workers screamed and fled. Some were too slow. Tons of stone tumbled down, crushing bodies, burying men alive. A single collapse could kill dozens. Walls fell for many reasons to few skilled hands. Rushed timelines shifting earth, but the outcome was always the same. Workers paid the price while lords demanded reconstruction. There were no investigations, no safety inspections, no rules. The medieval world accepted death in construction as it accepted death in childbirth, plague, or battle. Life was cheap. Labor was cheaper. And the danger didn't end with accidents. Even those who avoided catastrophe were slowly destroyed by the work itself. Constant lifting warped spines. Repetitive hammering deformed fingers and joints. Dust from sandstone and lime-filled lungs, leading to slow, choking deaths. Many died coughing blood, unable to draw breath, their bodies worn out decades before their time. Yet each morning they returned not out of courage, but necessity. A man with children needed coin. A man alone needed survival. There was no escape, no worker dreamed of glory. They dreamed of bread, of a night without pain, of living long enough to see spring after a brutal winter. If fortune smiled, they might get one day of rest, the Sabbath. But even then, many took on extra tasks to feed their families. Rest was a luxury only the wealthy understood. The church preached endurance, telling laborers that God rewarded suffering. But faith offered no shield against falling stone or collapsing wood. Some prayed before every climb. Some kissed crosses around their necks. Some whispered final words to the wind before stepping onto planks that might be their last dot. And women and children, they were there too. Women hauled water, mixed mortar in baskets strapped to their backs, cooked for hundreds, and carried stones nearly as large as themselves. Children fetched tools, gathered firewood, and served as apprentices. They couldn't lift full blocks, but they could scramble up narrow scaffolds with buckets or drive nails into beams. They learned danger early. Some watched fathers die on the job. Some grew up expecting the same fate. Castle building spared no one. It consumed entire families. Two distant observers. A rising castle looked magnificent, a symbol of ambition and power. But for those inside the site, it was a battlefield of exhaustion. Hammers never ceased. Stone grated against stone in an endless roar. Dust-coated eyes, clogged throats, turned sweat to mud. The ground trembled when heavy blocks dropped into place. The air reeked of wet lime, blood, and unwashed bodies. At night, silence fell but not peace. Workers retreated to huts or shared sheds lined with straw. Their bodies throbbed, hands pulsed with pain, backs burned. Many slept in mud or on bare earth, too poor for comfort. Wounds festered, infections spread. Some never woke. At dawn, a whistle or shout summoned them back. The castle didn't care who lived or died. The Lord didn't care. History wouldn't care. Yet somehow, despite all this, castles were built. Walls climbed higher. Towers pierced the clouds. Gatehouses took shape. Drawbridges were carved and fitted. Stone by stone, bone by bone, life by life, monuments of power rose from the earth. When at last the final block was set, the Lord walked proudly through his new fortress. Priests blessed the walls, nobles feasted, wine flowed, songs praised the king's vision and might. But the builders, they weren't invited, they weren't thanked, they weren't remembered. Many were already dead, buried in unmarked plots or lost in fields. Survivors simply moved on to the next lord, the next wall, the next desperate job. Castles were always needed. And there were always more men willing to break their bodies for a crust of bread. That is the brutal truth. Every castle standing today, every fortress admired by tourists, photographed for books, lauded for its artistry, was a machine that devoured human lives. The stones didn't rise through glory. They rose through agony. Every arch, every window, every turret is a monument to silent sacrifice. Workers faced heights that defied reason. They used tools that failed without warning. They balanced on wood that splintered. They lifted stones that killed. Some vanished under rubble. Some fell from scaffolds. Some died slowly, lungs choked with dust. Others survived, but with ruined bodies and shortened years. castles have endured for centuries. The workers did not. When people admire these ruins today, they rarely think of the sons who never saw their fathers return. The widows left with nothing, the lives cut short so a king could sleep safely behind thick walls. Yet the stones remember. The castle remembers. It stands as a silent witness to the suffering buried in its foundations, the story history refused to tell. As a castle neared completion, its hunger only grew. Stone alone wasn't enough. A castle was more than rocket, was a war machine. An architectural puzzle, a living fortress. To make it stand required knowledge, structure, and ruthless organization. And the medieval world, organized with iron discipline, a strict hierarchy, ruled the site. At the top stood the nobility, king, the lord, or powerful churchmen whose will birthed the fortress. They visited rarely, not to labor, but to inspect, criticize, and demand speed. Beneath them were the master masons and architects, the true minds behind the design. These elite craftsmen understood geometry, weight distribution, arch dynamics, and stone physics. They read blueprints, directed layouts, and ensured walls would endure centuries. But their brilliance didn't ease the burden on those below. It only intensified it. Master masons shouted orders, demanded perfection, and tolerated no error. A poorly cut stone was discarded. A misaligned wall was torn down and rebuilt. Slow. Workers were beaten or dismissed. Precision was enforced, not with kindness, but with fear. Because one flaw could bring down everything below, the masters stood the skilled trades. Stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths. Stonecutters split raw blocks into precise shapes, their hammers ringing across valleys like thunder. They shaved edges, carved angles, fitted pieces like a colossal puzzle. Respected though they were, respect didn't spare their lungs. Dust enveloped them hour after hour, crawling into their chests, turning breath into torture. Many died coughing, lungs hardened to stone, buried before the castle they shaped was finished. Carpenters built scaffolds, hoists, roofs, and supports. Their work was precise and perilous. A snapped pole meant death. A misjudged beam brought platforms crashing down. They lived knowing a single mistake could kill not just one man, but many. Yet they earned barely enough to feed their own children. Immense responsibility. Minimal reward. Blacksmiths forged every tool: chisels, nails, hinges, reinforcements, weapons. They stood before roaring furnaces in unbearable heat, sparks scorching their skin, sweat pouring endlessly. Burns scarred them permanently. The constant clang of hammer on anvil deafened them over time. But the forge never rested, because a broken tool meant lost time, and lost time meant punishment. Then came the lowest rank, the unskilled laborers, the peasants, the destitute, the desperate. These were the men who carried stones on their backs, dragged carts, mixed mortar, dug trenches, shoveled earth, hauled timber, and obeyed without question. They needed no skill, lowly strength, and obedience. They were paid least, fed worst, beaten hardest. Some were free men who chose this work because starvation loomed. Others were serfs forced into service by lords who owned their land. Many worked, barefoot on sharp stone and frozen ground. Some were criminals sentenced to labor instead of execution. Others were prisoners of war, watched by armed guards. A few were enslaved, outright treated like beasts. given only the bare right to live another day. These men were the backbone of construction. Without them, no castle could rise. Yet their lives were deemed disposable. If a laborer fell ill, no healer came. If he broke a bone, he was abandoned. If he died, his body was dragged away and another starving soul took his place, and still the work pressed on. A castle was more than walls. It required guardhouses, kitchens, chapels, storerooms, moats, wells, drawbridges, towers, each demanding planning, materials, and thousands of hands. Behind it all stood logistics, an immense, fragile supply chain. Imagine the effort to sustain a construction site. Thousands of stones, tons of sand, barrels of lime, giant logs, wagons of metal, endless food for workers. Carters drove ox-drawn wagons across rutted roads, hauling stone from quarries miles away. Farmers delivered grain. Boats carried heavy loads along rivers when roads failed. Every journey was slow, dangerous, exhausting. Thieves lurked. Wolves prowled. Floods washed out paths. Wheels shattered. Horses collapsed. Wagons toppled into ravines or sank in mud. If a shipment was delayed, workers stood idle and idle hands meant furious overseers. Punishments followed swiftly. Even water posed challenges. Castles needed deep wells, and digging one could take years. Workers descended into black pits on ropes, swinging picks by torchlight. If walls collapsed, they were entombed. If groundwater surged, they drowned. If air ran thin, they suffocated. Yet they kept digging because the castle demanded water. Organization was rigid, almost military. Foremen patrolled constantly. Overseers carried whips and sticks. Orders barked over the din of hammers and grinding stone. Workers were herded like cattle, slow, pushed, resistant, beaten, failed, replaced. Once outer walls were complete, a new phase of suffering began. Interior construction. Massive wooden beams had to be hoisted for floors, ceilings, roofs. Workers used treadwheel cranes, giant wooden wheels. Men walked inside like human hamsters, using their own weight to lift colossal loads. It was slow, exhausting, deadly. A slip inside the wheel could crush a man against the spokes. Vaulted ceilings required forests of wooden supports. Stones were laid in gravity-defying curves. If one support shifted, the ceiling collapsed, burying everyone beneath. No safety nets, no inspections, just hope and dread. Mortar had to be mixed endlessly, sand, lime, water stomped by bare feet in pits, until it became the glue holding the fortress together. Chemicals burned skin, fumes scarred lungs. Many developed rashes and sores that never healed. Even finishing touches were perilous. Sculptors dangled on ropes to carve high reliefs. One slip meant death. Painters climbed wobbling ladders to fresco walls. Glazers handled molten lead and razor-sharp glass, slicing their hands to ribbons. Every detail, every nail, every pane was born from someone's pain. Years turned to decades. Some castles took longer to build than a man's lifespan. A laborer might begin at 16 and die by 40, having spent his entire life on one fortress. His son would take his place, maybe his grandson too. Generations perished building what one lord would enjoy for a few short years. There's cruel irony here. Castles were designed to last forever. The workers who built them barely lasted a lifetime. When the final stone was laid and scaffolding came down, there was no celebration for the builders. Their job simply ended. Many were dismissed with coins barely enough for bread. Others were sent straight to the next project. A lucky few found permanent roles as guards or maintenance staff, but these were rare. The Lord, however, celebrated lavishly. Feasts were held. Clergy praised divine favor. Songs extolled the ruler's greatness. The castle became a symbol of power, wealth, and heavenly mandate. Visitors marveled at its strength. Travelers wrote of its grandeur. No one praised the workers. Most names were never recorded. Even master masons often left only a small, hidden marca-carved symbol on a stone, unnoticed unless you knew where to look. That was their signature across centuries. But laborers, they left nothing. Their existence vanished. And yet something of them remains, not carved in stone, but woven into silence. Today, tourists walk castle halls, snapping photos, admiring views, marveling at engineering. They speak of knights and kings, sieges and swords. Rarely do they think of the thousands of invisible lives that made it all possible, but the truth stands as firmly as the walls. Every stone was carried by trembling hands. Every tower costs lives. Every wall was raised by men who died unridded. If those workers could speak across time, what would they say? Not of glory, not of architecture, not of crowns or thrones. They'd speak of hunger, of pain, of cold mornings and blistering afternoons, of stones heavier than hope, of nights when their bodies ached too fiercely to sleep, of friends buried under rubble, of children growing up fatherless, of a world that took everything and gave nothing. And yet their suffering created something eternal. Castles endure. Stone outlives flesh. Walls outlast bones. The builders are forgotten, but their legacy remains. There's sadness in that beauty, too. Because while history erased their names, it couldn't erase their work. Every footstep on a castle stair, every echo in its halls, every shadow stretching across its battlements is a silent tribute to those who gave everything. Their story lives in the stones even if the world ignored it. And now, perhaps, the invisible are seen. The castle stands complete, its towers rising like the ribs of some petrified giant. What once existed only as sketches on parchment now scrapes the sky, casting long shadows over villages, forests, rivers. From afar, it looks glorious, majestic, eternal. But for the thousands who built it, the story didn't end when the scaffolds came down. In many ways, that's when their true hardship began. Because once the Lord declared his fortress finished, the workers weren't rewarded with comfort, honor, or security. The truth was colder than winter winds in empty corridors. They were forgotten. Some left with just enough coin for bread or travel. Others were dismissed without thanks, without farewell. They'd built walls kings would boast about for centuries, but there were no parades for the men who bled into the mortar, or buried friends whose names history discarded. Their footprints vanished under snow, rain, and time. Yet the castle's completion wasn't the end of toil. A fortress demanded caretakers, guards for gates, masons for repairs, carpenters for rotting beams, blacksmiths for weapons, servants for chambers. For some, this meant steady work, shelter, routine, blessing in a harsh world. But castles weren't peaceful. Disease spread in crowded halls. Fire could turn wooden interiors into infernos. Food shortages silenced banquet tables. And when the Lord rode to war, the castle became a target stone, walls attracting enemies like gold attracts thieves. Those who stayed often realized the fortress they'd built wasn't a sanctuary, but a burden. They missed open skies, sleeping under stars. Freedom, the very walls meant to protect them, felt like a cage. Once lost, freedom couldn't be reclaimed. Those who left seeking other work found the same cycle everywhere. Another fortress, another bridge, another cathedral, clawing toward heaven. Some men spent entire lives erecting monuments for people wealthier than they could imagine, only to die owning nothing. A mason who carved delicate limestone patterns might never sleep in a bed half as fine. A carpenter who built vaulted roofs might die in a leaking hut. The imbalance was obvious but unquestioned. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't fair. It wasn't meant to be. Then there were the soldiers' men who watched the castle rise but never touched its stones. They trained in courtyards, listened to hammers, watched drawbridges rise. When the fortress was done, they entered their own nightmare, expected to fight, bleed, kill, and die, defending walls others had built. Their lives were as expendable as arrows. Some stood in armor for years, waiting for a war that never came. When battle arrived, death offered no dignity, only chaos, terror, screams bouncing off walls that suddenly felt too low, too weak. The truth behind every medieval castle is contradiction. We imagine chivalry, shining armor, royal feasts, but castles were loud, dirty, crowded, dangerous. Kitchens smoked constantly. Great halls reeked of spilled ale, sweat, unwashed bodies. Livestock wandered courtyards. Sewage flowed in open channels. Rats and disease thrived. Outside, beauty. Inside, a chaotic machine powered by human suffering. Yet these forgotten workers changed the world, not with titles or wealth, but with stone and sweat. Some died before completion. Others died long after, never knowing their walls would outlive dynasties. Kings built castles to prove power, but history rarely remembers the builders' names. Their stories survive only in scars, legends, and broken grave markers. Without them, the stone giants of the medieval world would never have existed. When we gaze at castle ruins to cracked towers, worn staircases, battlements softened by centuries, we see the fingerprints of ordinary people. People who woke each morning with aching joints, lifted stones heavier than themselves, prayed for safety, and rarely found it. They shaped Europe not with pen or sword, but with calloused hands and backs bent under impossible weight. Imagine them now, a mason on the highest scaffold, wind tearing at his cloak, eyes stinging from dust as he carves a battlement. He doesn't know future generations will admire his craft. He only knows the foreman is shouting, the rope creaks dangerously, and one misstep means death. Imagine the carpenter balancing on beams high above the courtyard, hammering supports into place. Imagine the blacksmith's forge glowing red at midnight, sparks floating like fireflies as he shapes steel that will outlive him. None could imagine you, centuries later, staring at their work and wondering how they did it. If they knew, maybe it would matter. Maybe the thousands who worked until their bodies broke would feel pride, knowing people still ask how they built something so impossible. But history is strange. It writes books about kings and generals, rarely about the hands that lifted every stone, yet the castle remains silent, immovable, a monument to effort no one witnessed and suffering no one recorded. Today, we stand before these ruins in awe of architecture, engineering, beauty, but we seldom imagine the human cost: broken hands, lost fingers, crushed ribs, bodies buried in walls because it was cheaper than proper graves. Here is the hardest truth. The medieval world cared nothing for fairness, comfort, or mercy. Castles weren't built on dreams. They were built on backs. They weren't symbols of beauty. They were symbols of fear and control. The men who built them never walked their halls as honored guests. But time offers a quiet justice. Today, when we visit these places, we don't stand in awe of the Lord who commissioned the castle. We stand in awe of the workers who built it, the true masters of stone. Men who understood gravity, tension, balance, and strength. They passed knowledge hand to hand, generation to generation. Their skill was a gift hand, a prison. A mason's son likely died a mason. A boy learning carpentry at 12 might spend his life splitting wood and climbing scaffolds. The world offered no choices, only survival. Still, something in them refused to yield. Maybe pride, maybe hunger, maybe the faint hope their children might live better. Every stone they placed was a statement. We were here. We lived. We built. They couldn't write names on parchment, so they wrote them in stone. Centuries later, when kings are forgotten and dynasties turn to dust, their work remains. The stones still stand. The walls still rise. And even without knowing their names, the world remembers them. Every mason, carpenter, blacksmith, quarryman, rope puller, coal burner, mortar mixer, water carrier, and barefoot boy running across scaffolds. So the next time someone sees a castle and thinks of knights and crowns and royal feasts, let them remember this instead. The castle is not a monument to power. It is a monument to labor, to pain, to sacrifice, to human endurance, to thousands of ordinary people whose lives were harder than we can ever imagine. It was worse than history books say, worse than paintings show, worse than stories tell. But they did it anyway, and because they did, the world was changed forever.